Immediately after seizing power in November 1917, Lenin and his Bolshevik Party faced opposition. The anti-Bolshevik forces, forming in the provinces, who would eventually be called the Whites, opposite of his army, the Reds, would turn into a civil war by early 1918. To win the Civil War and have any hopes of creating a socialist state in Russia, Lenin felt he would need to pull Russia out of the war with Germany, World War I, that is. One of his first acts, then, was to sign a ceasefire with the Germans. Signing a peace treaty proved to be more difficult because Germany was in the position to demand much from the Bolsheviks. Although Lenin did not want to give up land lost by the Tsar's army, he had no choice. On March 3rd, 1918, the Bolsheviks and Germans signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, by which Russia lost 1/3 of its population, 1/4 of its territory, and half of its industries. Eventually, Russia would have peace, because by 1922, the Bolsheviks would win the civil war that was about to begin. Now, why did the Civil War begin? Well, remember that many Russian groups had been alienated by the Bolsheviks in their quest for power over the course of 1917. Those Russians who had voted in the November elections for other political parties banded together to create a white army to take on Bolshevik control. Well, once that civil war begins, Lenin realizes that should the Red Army lose the civil war, it is possible the Tsar could be restored to power. In order to prevent that from happening, the Bolshevik guards who had guarded the royal family held under house arrest since the Tsar's abdication awoke the family in the middle of the night, took them to a basement room, pictured here on the bottom right, and murdered the entire family. And the Civil War was underway. In order to win the war, Lenin would need to take drastic measures. The Red Army fought against the White Army, both of which claimed to love the country. There were new boundaries created out of the lands that Russia had to sign away to Germany in order to leave World War I. Then, about a year later, Germany lost World War I and was forced by the Treaty of Versailles to give up all of that land it had recently taken from Russia. Many of those former Russian Empire peoples who had wanted independence finally got it. The Finns, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Estonians all emerged from World War I with their own countries. Then, in the midst of the Russian Civil War, several Allied countries leaving World War I joined the White Army in Russia to fight against the communist takeover. Britain, the United States, Japan, and France all participated in the Russian Civil War between 1918 and 1922. Despite all of that, Lenin and the Bolsheviks win. Why? Well, it's because of those drastic measures that Lenin took, including something called war communism. War communism involved such measures as seizing grain from peasants in the countryside to feed Bolshevik troops and workers in the cities. The state held the right to take anything from anyone that it felt might help them win the war. War communism also employed harsh police state tactics. Lenin organized a secret police called the Cheka and charged it with arresting and killing all enemies of the revolution. Thousands of suspected traitors were executed or sent to prison over the course of the Civil War. Now, Lenin's and Trotsky's leadership at the helm here of the Red Army, Trotsky, and the Bolshevik Party, Lenin, led to great success. Both men were masters at what they did. In addition, the Bolsheviks controlled central Russia, which is housed most of the industry that Russia had at its disposal. The whites were also a divided group of people with many leaders and many different aims. This caused a very divided war effort as different groups followed different leaders, and there was no clear vision for the post-Civil War era. The peasants also supported Reds more than the whites due to the promises the Bolsheviks made over the course of the war. So by 1922, the chaos in Russia is coming to a close. Lenin focused on transforming Russia from a backward feudal society to a modern industrialized nation. Lenin wanted Russia to become a model for Marxist society, free from poverty, unemployment, and homelessness. Lenin also hoped to rid Russia of the illiteracy and class distinctions that had been characteristic of Tsarist Russia. But he did face overwhelming odds. Added to the millions of casualties and the billions of dollars lost in World War I, the Russian Civil War caused the loss of millions more Russians to death, injury, and immigration, and the destruction of billions of dollars worth of property and tremendous economic hardships. By 1921, wages in Russia had dropped to 1/10 of their pre-war levels, while inflation stood at well over 1,000%. Western nations who were opposed to communist rule in Russia had blockaded Russia so that nothing could enter or leave the country. Factories stood silent, and Russia's major cities had become ghost towns. Moscow had lost half of its population, and Petrograd almost 2/3. Because of these hardships, Lenin realized that the people of Russia might soon believe that the Bolshevik policies of communism was responsible for the destruction of Russia, as opposed to the decade of war that the country was just emerging from. In order to prevent that belief from spreading, Lenin instituted a new economic policy in 1921. This radical policy reintroduced limited capitalism, and it was described by Lenin as, quote, taking one step backward to go 2 steps forward. According to the NEP, peasants would have the right to sell their surplus crops at market. Private retail shops were also reopened, and entrepreneurs were encouraged to produce consumer goods, and foreign investors were enticed to invest capital in Russian industries. Private theater and publishing were allowed. all of this private ownership of industry and business is capitalistic in nature. The government does not own or control the factors of production under the new economic policy. However, the central government did retain control of major industries in Russia, like mining, steel production, and transportation. Lenin hoped to jumpstart the Russian economy, to get it back on its feet after nearly a decade of war, shortages, suffering, and instability. The NEP was a huge success, and many Russians became wealthy. A healthy economy resurfaced, signaled by Russia's return to pre-war production levels and renewed international trade. The economic disasters of World War I and the revolutionary period had been somewhat reversed. With the economy on the upswing, Lenin could turn to the creation of the modern society that he desired. For centuries, Russians had lived under the feudal regime of the czars, in which the few nobles and clergy at the top held all prestige, power, and privilege. Lenin reversed this situation by passing laws that ensured the equality of men and women, gave the right to vote to all citizens, and disallowed noble titles and ranks. The church was stripped of its land, money, and influence in education and the government. The Bolshevik Party, now called the Communist Party, believed that the key to creating a classless society was to become industrially self-sufficient. To do this, the party leaders felt workers and peasants would have to be educated. Thus, the Communist Party undertook a broad school-building campaign to attack illiteracy. Also, Russians had long suffered from poor health care. The party built hospitals and clinics across the country and trained thousands of doctors, many of whom were women. Under the communists, many aspects of the old regime of czarist rule were changing. And then, in 1924, a leadership crisis emerged. Lenin, the leader of the communists, the architect of the revolution, had a series of strokes, and he died. The question is, who will replace him? There are two front runners to replace Lenin at the head of the party. The first is Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had been right there with Lenin, planning and preparing the revolution, leading the Red Guards, leading the Red Army through the Civil War. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's right-hand man. The second person who emerges as a front runner to replace Lenin is a man named Joseph Stalin. Stalin had been a low-level party member, but had moved up through the ranks of party leadership. And so by 1924, Lenin is in the inner circle of the leadership, the elite leadership of the Bolshevik or Communist Party. However, some other party leaders, like these two men here, Zinoviev and Kamenev, saw that Stalin was no good. He was anti-socialist. The NEP was anti-socialist. Stalin was anti-socialist, and that Stalin believed in the theory of one-man rule. Stalin, in the face of this opposition, is able to rally support to his side. Then these two men team up with Leon Trotsky to unite to stop Stalin from becoming a dictator. They take an anti-NEP and an anti-Stalin position, and Trotsky tells Stalin to his face in 1925, quote, "You are the grave digger of the revolution." Trotsky and his allies are very clear that Stalin does not harbor the same values that the Communist Party stands for. This struggle continues. Stalin is able to attract more support, and the support he attracts is just the right kind that has positions of power. Trotsky and his allies are accused of conspiracy against the party, and they are removed from their positions of power in the upper echelons of the Communist Party. Despite this, all three of them kept up their attacks on Stalin, and by December of 1927, they are thrown out of the Communist Party completely. Stalin then has Trotsky exiled in January of 1928, and Trotsky is removed from the country, meaning that Stalin is now a virtual dictator in Russia. Trotsky here at the bottom, replaced by Stalin as the dictator. This brings us to the end of the Russian Revolution lecture series. There will be more videos to come on Stalin, the dictator. Thanks so much for watching.